Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen from SMB Nation. If you're in Seattle, it's lunchtime. If you're on the East Coast, it's mid-afternoon. Dinner time over in Europe and a very early breakfast over in Asia. So thank you for joining us for the fall quarter for MSP Tech Talk. This is our kickoff lecture that we're going to get to in a moment. I am coming to you live from Austin, Texas at SpiceWorks annual Spice World Conference, Spice World 2018. Boy, that's a whole nother story. I'll tell you, I equate it to, someone once told me, and I concur, it's the Comic Con of IT Pro conferences. So it's got a good vibe, a good culture, people wearing costumes. Last night, we had our party, our celebration at the Austin City Limits Theater with live music. It's a must-do. Just one more comment on that. Put it on your calendar for 2019. Now, it's a slightly different audience. It's top-heavy on IT pros. However, it's a technical conference, and so it's a geekathon. Everybody can relate to product stack conversations. That's really what it is. And so put it on your calendar for 19. You need to do Spice World once in your career. A little bit more housekeeping. Next week, I'll be in Montreal up at SureWeb's Accelerate Conference. That's Thursday, Friday in Montreal. Got a fluff day on both sides in Boston if you want to get together. Following week, a week off, then it's off to Ingram 1 in Washington, D.C., followed by Channel Pro down in L.A. On Election Day, of all things, November 6th. So let me know if you're around and want to get together at any of those shows. Always happy to have a little bit of fun. Please use the questions feature to ask your questions today. And finally, a shout out to those that make it possible. As you know, we're launching fall quarter with the MSP Tech Talk. We have 12 weeks of lectures coming up, and it's possible in part, a very big part due to our sponsors. So today is SolarWinds MSP in what we call SolarWinds MSP Anywhere. You can find some videos, smbnation.com, click on videos, and you can see 3 videos I did that review some different conversations from SolarWinds MSP Anywhere. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And check the handout section. So we have some goodies up for you on your control panel in the handout section. Ken, I'm almost out of air, my friend. I need to revert over to you so we can get started with what is a timely topic, popular topic. Ken Dwight, and Ken, I'll let you self-introduce yourself, but before we get to that, I just want to tell the audience, if we roll back, and you're going to have to help me, was that a year ago or 2 years ago, with the hurricane that hit Houston, and we conjured up the MSP Navy? Why don't we start with that, what you did with Tim Lonnie, then introduce yourself, and we'll get going.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great introduction. Yes, it was a little bit over a year ago that Hurricane Harvey hit Houston and southeast Texas, and we have the unfortunate distinction of now holding the record for the most rainfall in the U.S. in one system. The previous record was held in Hawaii at 50 inches. We unfortunately made 52 inches. And a lot of what you saw on TV was accurate. There really was a lot of flooding. Fortunately, I was blessed. I was not directly affected by it. My home and my office and the road in between were high and dry, basically. So I was in the office every day of the storm. Didn't even lose power. So
there you go.
Unusual in that sense. But
yeah, what's your story? So what's your background? And we're going to talk about malware today.
Well, as I've got some bullet points, and of course, I think my webcam's working and you see me live, but there's a bigger picture of me. I'm even older than you are, Harry. I've been in this industry for 52 years now.
Good Lord.
Back in the punch card days on mainframes and assembly language programming and all that back in 1966. And when the PCs came out, when IBM announced their personal computer, I thought, well, these toy computers have been around for a few years now, but if IBM's in the business, then they're probably going to show up in businesses. And so in 1982, I bought my first IBM PC and have been mostly in that part of the industry ever since. And jumped into Windows pretty early also, not in the very early stages, not in the Windows 286 or 386, but Windows 3.0 was, I think, the first really mainstream version. Yeah. And that's when I got into the graphical user interface and the mouse and point and click and all the things we just take for granted today back in 1986. So that's 32 years now in Windows.
Unbelievable.
Of course, there's been a lot of evolution in the industry, and I've tried to roll with the punches and evolve along with it, although not always as quickly as I should have in retrospect. But back in 2002, viruses were becoming an issue, and pretty simplistic back then compared to where we are today. But I developed a specialty in viruses and what we now know as malware in 2002, and actually trademarked the name the Virus Doctor. So fast forward a little bit, for the last 20 years, most of what I've been doing has actually been training, teaching mostly other techs. I do some end user training as well, but my real heart is in training geeks. And so at the moment, I have graduates of my training in 48 states. The two that I'm missing, by the way, are Alaska and Montana. So if you know anybody in those states that would like some geek training, I'd love to put those last two pins on the map.
Well, I'll talk to you offline because I grew up in Alaska. So I lived there 22 years before I moved to Seattle. So we'll talk offline, okay?
All right, I'd love to do that. And my international count is up to 8 foreign countries now.
Yeah.
And so like Harry, I'm in all the time zones, and have graduates all over the place, and it's I like it. I am based in Houston. That's where I'm coming to you from today, but I jump on a lot of airplanes and go wherever there's a need. So a little bit about who this presentation is really intended for. It's obviously you guys. This is a special presentation for SMB Nation people, and mostly IT support technicians in one form or another. My focus is on outsourced IT support organizations, whether you're an MSP, a break-fix shop, a consultant, a computer repair shop, or whatever. All of us have a need for learning more about malware. I do have some people that take my training and that I consult with in-house IT support departments, but that's kind of a different environment, and so I'll just kind of leave it at that. But what's in it for you? Why should you spend the next hour and a half of your life watching this? Well, I'm going to be sharing knowledge that you can start using today. This isn't just a theoretical pie in the sky, nice to know discussion. It's things you can actually start putting to use right away. Those of you that don't know me and haven't heard any of my presentations before, I'll just tell you that what you get from me is filtered and distilled. There's a lot of smoke out there, and a lot of self-promotion and things that are definitely have a bias to them. But what you get from me is filtered through all that, and it's distilled that right down to information that I can personally vouch for. And along with that, you get my insight based on over 50 years in the industry, and especially on malware-related issues. At the end, there will be an offer for you to get more in-depth information, but we'll get to that when the time comes, along with a special offer for attendees of this presentation. As far as some specific learning objectives, I want to talk about the 4 stages of malware removal, and within that, defining the 4 categories of malware, and how to keep from spending hours scanning an infected computer, and how to keep malware from coming back after you found it and removed it. Now, one thing that I have heard more of recently, and it kind of took me aback when I first heard it, but a lot of techs are saying, I'm not seeing nearly as much malware now as we used to. And if you think about it, the wording of that is key. I'm not seeing as much. Point is, there's more now than ever. And of course, as part of my ongoing research, I'm in touch with most of the major anti-malware vendors. I get their newsletters, I read their blog posts, I have personal phone calls with them. I'm on top of the industry and a lot of different perspectives. And what I'm going to show you here is some actual numbers from the latest numbers we have from the second quarter of 2018. From Malwarebytes, their second quarter analysis says that cryptojacking is king. That's one of the newer trends in malware, and there's a lot of it out there now. Trojan backdoors are up 442% over last year, and that's on the residential side. On the commercial side, ransomware, of course, is big, up 28% over last year. And adware and exploits are on the rise. Additional numbers from McAfee. They're showing, and again, second quarter 2018, coin miner malware is up 86%, over 2.5 million new samples. And there were 990,000 for ransomware. So crypto mining is bigger in their analysis than ransomware these days. Look at JavaScript, up to 204%, more than 7 million new samples there. So you're not seeing that. It's there, but most of us aren't seeing it. So that's one of the main points I want to start off with, that yeah, you may not be seeing nearly as much of it, but trust me, there is no shortage in the growth of malware. So as far as malware removal, it's potentially a great opportunity for us, because when it happens, the client or user is in trouble. And in a lot of cases, it's a high visibility problem. So it's not a big secret within the organization, or even unfortunately sometimes for their clients, their users, or whatever. Usually when it happens, they assume it's their fault. It's something they've done wrong, which it actually usually is in one way or another. And in a lot of cases, they can't use the computer, or they don't dare use the computer until the problem is solved. So they're looking to you as the expert. It's your chance to shine. That's the good news. The bad news is a lot of MSPs, a lot of break-fix shops are losing money and or clients on malware removal. And a lot of times when you first get the indication that it's a malware issue, your first reaction is, oh crap, because you really don't know how it's going to turn out, whether you're going to be the hero or the goat, whether you're going to make money or lose money. And spoiler alert, you're probably going to lose money if you're doing things the traditional way. The most common way you're going to lose money is it's going to take a lot more time to resolve it than you can bill for. Either you're an MSP, they're paying you a fixed monthly fee, and you just blow right through all of that time that you're expecting to have to use for it, or you're on an hourly basis, and the reality is the most you can probably bill for a malware removal on a computer is a couple of hours. Beyond that, the client or the user starts thinking in terms of, well, I could buy a new computer for that, or whatever. And you and I know that's not really a fair analysis, but that's the way clients think. Unfortunately, in some cases, no matter what you try, you just can't resolve the problem. And of course, that leaves you with egg on your face and an unhappy client. Or even worse, sometimes your attempts at repairs do make things worse, all the way up to the dreaded blue screen of death. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you decide that the only real solution is to rebuild the system, wipe and reload, which is a horrible solution in most cases, but it's what a lot of attacks do, either by default or in desperation.
Hey, I've had those days. I'm raising my hand.
Yeah, most techs have. But here's the worst of it. You may think you've got it solved, and a day or two later, you get a call from the client, and they're really unhappy because the problem's back, either in exactly the same form or something that doesn't look exactly the same, but of course they're going to blame it on you for not really getting rid of the problem in the first place.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the downside and what could happen. So to kind of set the stage here, most techs, and I talked to hundreds of techs over the last 10 years or so, and universally, most of them follow one of two basic approaches. Either, and this is the most common, they throw a bunch of scans at it. They scan with Malwarebytes, and they scan with Norton, and they scan with McAfee, and Trend Micro, and Kaspersky. And there's one shop here in Houston that still, their routine is to scan with 8 different anti-malware programs, which, here again, spoiler alert, that's not going to find and fix all the malware. Unfortunately, the other option, which again, a lot of those shops do, some as a normal routine, is to wipe and reload the system, also known as nuke and pave, which in most cases is a horrible solution. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, it's not one that I recommend hardly ever. We'll talk about that shortly. But the point is, neither one of these approaches is in your best interest or the best interest of the infected user. There is a better way. So talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. If you run one or multiple scans, I call that the Superstition or the Voodoo approach. You're counting on that black box in the form of software to find and fix all your problems, to do your work for you. Well, if that's the approach you're taking, the first consideration is what program or programs to use. And even the techs that use this approach, I don't think any of them expect one program to find and remove everything. And so typically if they're doing the scans, it's with multiple programs. So which ones? The next question is what sequence? Which one do you run first? What's next? And what's after that? And on and on and on. That matters. At that, each one of them has its different options and settings you can click, enable, disable, or whatever. And that matters a lot in terms of the effectiveness and the time it's going to take. Now, here's one of the dirty little secrets about a lot of those scanning programs. A lot of them have been around for a long time. And the ones that have been around for a long time that are still out there probably have daily definition updates. And so they at least give the illusion that they're staying up to date. Well, here's the dirty little secret of a lot of them. Yeah, they may have new signatures, but in a lot of them, they don't know anything about some of the new infection vectors, some of the new methods that are being used to get into the system or to hide or whatever. And so even though you have that security blanket of current updates, and it shows that you're up to date on that scanning program, again, they're whole areas of infection they may not know anything about. So big hole right there. And in a lot of cases, depending on the particular piece of malware you're dealing with, it may block the ability to run any of these scanning programs. So that's a pretty basic problem right there. But the worst of it is the time that it takes, because even if each one only takes 20 or 30 minutes, if you're running 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 of them, you're talking about hours or a full day worth of scan time. So much for productivity. Now, granted, that's not hands-on keyboard time that the technician is having to be paid by the hour. It could be multitasking, doing multiple machines or whatever. But as far as the client's concerned, it's that much time that they're not able to use that machine, that they're unproductive. And in some cases, their whole business may be shut down waiting for all those scans to finish. So what about wiping and reloading? This is what I call the well-meaning friend approach, because a lot of people that know something about IT, as you know, a common thing is, well, I've got a friend that knows about computers. And what they know how to do is to wipe and reload, which usually means bringing the computer back to what it looked like when it first came out of the box. And a whole lot of problems with that. Now, I will acknowledge that if you have a situation where you're doing regular full image backups and you have a pretty recent one, pretty recent, you can use your own definition, but if it's within a day or a few days, then I'm okay with using that as a reimage and pick up from there. But if you're talking about going back to what it looked like when it first came out of the box, that can be catastrophic. It's almost never what the user wants. They don't usually understand what's really involved there, what their outcome is going to be after the wipe and reload and the rebuilding. And so one thing you can count on with a wipe and reload situation is something is going to be lost. The catch is you don't know whether it's going to be probably not user data. You've got enough programs and enough things to help you salvage all the user data if the hard drive is still usable, which presumably it will be, or there's a cloud backup or whatever. But a bigger problem is on programs or on settings or defaults or just things that you don't generally think about. So point is, it's not going to look the same after that wipe and reload is finished. And there again, doing it right is going to take a lot more time than you can bill for. And when I say 6 to 8 hours here, I know a lot of you are laughing at that because it's more typically in the range of 24 hours. Again, maybe not all hands-on keyboard time, but elapsed time the client was out the use of the computer, typically 24 hours is a pretty reasonable expectation. So neither one of those is really what I consider an acceptable method. The alternative is to use the methodology. So in talking about the methodology that I came up with over 10 years ago, and I've been spreading the word ever since, we talk about the 4 categories of malware that could be present. You're going to want to deal with those categories in a specific sequence we're going to go into. As I say, I developed this methodology over 10 years ago, and I've continually updated it to accommodate the new threats, new infection vectors, new hiding places, new payloads, new everything. One of the most common questions I get is, how can I possibly stay current on all the changes? And my stock answer used to be I had to read 3 hours a day. Well, unfortunately, now it's more like 5 hours a day. So yes, I'm continuously reading and dealing with infected systems. And possibly more importantly, I have hundreds of graduates of my training out there now that can call me and ask for my help. And so sometimes that's my canary in the coal mine, to see what new threats are out there, get a firsthand look at them, access them remotely, and go through whatever it takes to get past them.
Hey, Ken.
Hundreds of techs now using this methodology worldwide. And what I'm going to show you today is the full methodology, things you can literally start using as soon as this webinar is over. And there are some proprietary tools I've also developed that can speed up the process. But you'll have the methodology before this webinar is over. But following the methodology and with the correct tools and procedure, you can take a computer, no matter how badly infected it is, to be malware free in less than 1 hour in most cases. Now, there is a big qualifier here. If you are dealing with encrypting ransomware, then that introduces another whole issue in terms of what it could take to get the data back. But other than that, in terms of getting rid of the malware and getting the machine back to being fully usable and uninfected, typically done in less than an hour with this methodology and all the tools that are available to you. So, 4 stages of malware removal. First, detection. Make that basic determination, is this computer infected by some type of malware? Once you've decided that it is, you need to identify it. Now, here I'm not talking about an exact identification of the particular piece of malware you're dealing with as much as the classification. Which of the 4 categories that we're going to talk about does it fall into? Neutralization. You need to stop it in its track, keep it from doing whatever it's doing, whether that's encrypting files or stealing data or turning it into a botnet or whatever. You need to stop it from doing whatever that payload happens to be. And then finally, actually removal. So those are the 4 stages. As far as the 4 categories, the first one we want to talk about is encrypting ransomware. Of course, starting off with Cryptolocker over 4 years ago. In fact, it just turned 5 years old now. Came out in September of 2013. So 5 years that encrypting ransomware has been a major player in the malware field. Next is an older one, rogues, also known as PUPs or potentially unwanted programs. Then you get into traditional malware. And that's where I've categorized the viruses, worms, and Trojan horses, which are the main categories of malware that we've dealt with for years and years now. I do want to make a little distinction here because sometimes in conversation and even in this presentation, you'll hear talk about botnets and keyloggers and backdoors and things like that. And those aren't really forms of malware. Those are payloads. So the form of malware usually comes in viruses, worms, Trojan horses, or the 4th category here of rootkits. So those are the 4 categories that I'm talking about. And in terms of dealing with them, you want to deal with them in that order. Here's a flow chart that actually lays out the whole methodology. And we'll come back to this. You can refer back to it or take a screen capture or whatever, because you'll see that we're talking about the 4 categories here in that sequence. First, if there is encrypting ransomware, you want to deal with that, both to get rid of the ransomware itself, but more importantly, to be sure that you've got the data files unencrypted or recovered from backups or whatever you need to do there when possible. Once you've finished dealing with that, then you come down to the 2nd category, PUPs and rogues. And with each of these first 2 categories, the nice thing about it, there's not going to be any question whether you've got them. They're very obvious, very much in your face. They want you to know they're there and deal with them and pay them. So point is, after ransomware, deal with the PUPs and rogues, and that's a pretty easy one in the overall scheme of things. But then you come down to this next decision box here, which is dealing with traditional malware, the viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. And that's where you're going to spend most of your time and effort. And we're not going to go into this whole procedure here, but that's a pretty simplified look at what this methodology calls for in dealing with each individual infected process. And that's what we're going to be doing, is looking at every process that's running and making a determination as to whether it's malicious or not. But at the initial stage, I'm calling it suspicious because you can't know for sure just at a glance. We'll call it suspicious, and the purpose of the rest of this is to make that determination whether it really is malicious, and if so, what to do with it. So that's an iterative process. You'll do one process at a time until eventually you've gone through all of them. Then you come down here and see if there's a rootkit present, deal with it. And there could be more than one. There usually isn't, but just make sure you've gotten rid of whatever rootkit there is. At that point, all the malware has been neutralized, but there still maybe some pieces left behind. So at that point, you want to do a deep scan to find and get rid of all those pieces. And finally, some of the more sophisticated malware in the last few years has started activating itself through Task Scheduler at some delayed times. So you may not be seeing it right away. So the final step is to check Task Scheduler and see if there's any malicious tasks waiting to be performed. So that's kind of where we're going. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into ransomware and talk about what you can do about it. First of all, again, you have to get rid of this before you go into any of the later categories of malware. And it's going to be obvious. There's no question about it. You'll almost certainly have something on the desktop itself. In some cases, the whole desktop has been overwritten by a ransom note, or there may be multiple ransom notes on the desktop, and certainly a ransom note in every folder of every folder that has been encrypted. So there's not going to be any question that ransomware is in place if it is. But really, there are 2 separate issues you need to deal with there. One is removing the infection, and that's easy. I haven't yet seen a piece of encrypting ransomware that the infection is hard to get rid of. The hard part, potentially, is restoring the encrypted data files. And I say here, it's complicated. There are a lot of variables here that will determine whether you can get the data back and how. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Now, just in case any of you have never seen this firsthand, here's what the original Cryptolocker looked like, again, over 5 years ago now, September of 2013. This was a screenshot from the very first version of Cryptolocker. And all of the imitators since then have followed a lot of the same general approaches that Cryptolocker did. Now, encrypting ransomware wasn't new at that point. I wrote a book about malware back in 2005, and I mentioned it then. So the concept isn't new. What was new about Cryptolocker, though, was they really followed best practices in terms of encryption and covering their tracks and doing things in a way that the average user or even the average tech really couldn't do anything about it other than pay the ransom. Now, we've come a long way since then, and done a lot of variations. There are now thousands of different pieces of encrypting ransomware out there, new ones every day, hundreds of new ones every day, and so it's not important to know the exact number, but the point is that number is still going up. And in fact, that one figure you saw, up 28% over last year from one of the most credible vendors. But that's what it looks like. So the main thing you need to know is what not to do. There are two, what I call fatal mistakes that the average tech is going to do when they're first running into a ransomware situation. The first thing they're going to do is go scan. Don't do that, at least not initially. The problem is you don't really know what your options are for dealing with this ransomware. We'll talk about those options in just a second after we get past the what not to do's. But the point for now is don't start by scanning the system for malware. If you do, you may lose your ability to recover those encrypted data files. So the point is you have to identify the exact family and strain of ransomware before you know what your options are. Now, at this point, if you know for sure that you have usable backups and that they are reasonably current, like in the last day or two, and you know that you can access them, and you know that they haven't been encrypted, which a lot of times they will be, then you can pretty much ignore this, go ahead and get rid of the ransomware, restore from your backups, and move on. But until you know that for sure, don't do any scanning. The other fatal mistake that I see a lot of techs making is wiping and reloading. There's absolutely no reason to do that, and there's no benefit from it. It does introduce all the problems we talked about a few minutes ago, and there's no benefit. In every case of encrypting ransomware I have seen or even heard about, there is no permanent damage done to the system, to the programs, to the settings, to anything else on there. It's just a data issue. And if you've got the ability to restore that data from backups or to decrypt the data files, there's absolutely no reason to wipe and reload the system. That's just going to stall the overall return to normalcy for that system. So I talk about three possible outcomes. These are not in order of likelihood, but they're in order of desirability. In some cases, you can actually decrypt the data files without paying the ransom. It is a possibility. It's not a likely possibility, but it is a possibility. And I've personally had two situations where I did exactly that. So it's something you may be able to do. Another possibility, it's not as pleasant, but in most cases, the files are going to be decryptable if you pay the ransom. I'm not recommending you pay the ransom. I am saying that in most cases, the ransomware creators have made the business decision that it's in their best interest to give you your data files back if you do pay the ransom. So depending on what's at stake and what some of the other considerations are, that may be an option that the user needs to consider. But there's a third possible outcome as well. That is that even if you pay the ransom, you still can't get the data files back. In some cases, that's because, well, we're dealing with criminals here. And some of them have made the other business decision that, screw you, we've got your money, we don't need to give you anything. So the point is you need to know that before you pay the ransom. But in other cases, even if they intend to get the data files back to you once you paid the ransom, a lot of the ransomware that's out there now is just people that have bought exploit kits. They bought ransomware kits, and so they can have their own ransomware. They don't really understand. It's more or less a script kiddie to a different level. They don't know that much about programming, about encryption, about decryption, and so even if you pay the ransom, they can't get the data files back. The point is you need to know that before you make a decision on what you're going to do about it. So as far as identifying the ransomware,
Hey, Ken?
Yes, Harry.
Yeah, Ken, if you don't mind, we're at the bottom of the hour. I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping.
Okay,
Folks,
get to that slide.
We're with Ken Dwight today. He's coming from Houston, Texas. There we go. I am in Austin, Texas, at the the home of SolarWinds actually, but I'm actually at the SpiceWorks Spice World 2008 conference at the Austin Convention Center. And we're bringing this broadcast to you with the underwriting and the generous support of SolarWinds MSP Anywhere. So if you go to smbnation.com and go to videos, and I'm going to get these links to you in the thank you notification, but we have 8 ways to take control of your technician's efficiency, 8 ways to take control of your business. So those are both videos and papers that we have resources for you. And again, appreciate the support of SolarWinds to make the MSP Tech Talk Fall Quarter possible. Ken, I have a question. Would you like to take a question now, or do you like questions later?
I've done this enough times that I pretty much know what questions are likely to come up, and so I'll probably be covering it. But if it's something I've already talked about that there's a question about, I'll be glad to go ahead and take those now.
Well, why don't we take one? And I have a funny one from Kit. Kit was asking, what are the logos in the background on my camera? And Kit, I looked behind and the logos appear. They are not flight wings from the U.S. Air Force, but those are little notebook icons set off on an angle as artwork. So we'll take care of that. But here we have Kevin Garman asking, since most ransomware also encrypts files located on network drives, the workstation's access, it would be a good idea to disconnect patient 0 from a network or shut it down as soon as it's discovered. So it's more of a comment than a question, but you have an end node, patient 0, disconnect from the network. Ken, what do you think about that?
I agree. The problem is identifying patient 0, because typically with a ransomware infection, the encrypted files are on the server, but the server itself is not infected. And so you have to backtrack and figure out what workstation the actual infection was on that in turn led to that encryption of the files that are on the server.
Okay, please continue. We're ready to get back on track. Thank you, Ken.
All right. Okay, let's go back into here then. And okay, we got through the what not to do, the possible outcomes. Okay, so as far as identifying the ransomware, there are a lot of clues that you can pick up on. The ransom note itself will frequently say, you've been encrypted by such and such ransomware. And so that's a starting point for making that determination. Bear in mind, it may or may not be accurate. There's a lot of piracy in ransom notes. Again, a lot of these people are lazy. They're using something somebody else wrote, so you can't necessarily take that as gospel. But if it names itself as a particular family of ransomware, then that could be a starting point. The format and content of the ransom note could be an indicator as well, but there again, there's a lot of duplication and piracy. The location and the file names of the ransom note. Typically, again, it'll show up in every folder that has encrypted files, and typically in 3 or 4 different file types. There may be a JPEG, maybe an HTML or HTML, it could be a .doc, .txt, and they're going to tell you about the fact you've been encrypted, you need to pay the ransom, and here's the Bitcoin wallet, and that sort of thing. And so they're going to make it available to you in multiple places, so there's no question about how to pay them. One of the more reliable indicators of what family of ransomware you're dealing with is most of them will change or add an extension to the file type. And so where a file may have been something .doc or docx, it may now have an additional extension beyond that. And that's a pretty reliable indicator of what family of ransomware you're dealing with. In some cases, they'll change the entire file name, which I don't think is really very smart on their part, because if you see some random file name, you're not really going to recognize how important this file may be to you. So if I were a ransomware creator, I wouldn't change the file name, but a lot of them do. So one more indicator that may let you know what family of ransomware you're dealing with. And also, they may or may not change the file size as part of the encryption. The really only sure way to know exactly what family and strain of ransomware you're looking at is to actually look inside the files themselves, which is normally something beyond what you and I would be able to do. But the anti-malware vendors are doing that on a regular basis. Trust me, right now, every serious anti-malware vendor is analyzing dozens or hundreds or thousands of encrypted files to figure out exactly what's been changed and how to try to reverse engineer it and come up with a decryption key. And they're sometimes successful at that. But without you and me having to do that or contact each vendor individually, there are a couple of sites that will help with it. The earliest one that I was using and still do is called ID Ransomware. There's the whole URL to it, but you can just do a Google search for ID Ransomware. That'll take you there, and it'll have you upload a ransom note and a sample of an encrypted file. And then based on that, it'll analyze those pieces of data and come back to you with this is a such and such family of ransomware and maybe a particular strain, and tell you a little bit more about it, including whether there is a free decryptor available. Now, when you hear about free encryptor or free decryptors, that sounds very promising. And I don't have a current count, but there are hundreds of free decryptors out there. That's the good news. The bad news is they have a very short shelf life, because when an anti-malware vendor figures out a way to decrypt encrypted data files for a particular infection, the word gets out, and it also gets out to the bad guys, who will pretty quickly update their encryption algorithm to keep that from working anymore. So yes, there may be hundreds of free decryptors out there. My guess would be that right now, there may be 3 or 4 of them that work, and those are the ones that were released today. So possible, but it's not a high likelihood. But the other nice thing about this, it will also tell you what your other options are. It'll tell you whether paying the ransom will get your data files back. And a lot of times it's pretty vague. And again, with all the imitators that are out there and all the people that bought the source code, a particular ransomware from one family, one strain may be decryptable and another strain may not. So it's not an absolute, but it's at least a starting point for letting you know what you're dealing with, what your options may be. There's another site that came out later, but it has a lot more players involved now. It's called More Ransom. This is actually a European site that was initially created by 2 anti-malware vendors and 2 government agencies, Europol and I forget who the other government agency was, but the point is they did the same type of thing, a little bit different way of doing it. But since then, a lot of other vendors and agencies have jumped on board. Last I heard, there were over 70 different participants in this project. So that's a little bit more memorable URL to go to, nomoreransom.org. And within that website, there's a link called Crypto Sheriff that will have you upload 2 encrypted files plus the ransom note, or if you don't have a ransom note, just some of its contents. If you remember some of the wording from the ransom note, they go through the same type of procedure that ID Ransomware does, and again, we'll let you know what your options may be in dealing with that particular encryption and infection. Another great site that most of us have probably been using for a long time for a lot of stuff is Bleeping Computer. Anytime that I see an encryption for the first time, Bleeping Computer is always where I start, because they're right on top of what's going on out there, the free decryptors, the different vendors, who's doing what, that sort of thing. So I can't say enough good things about Bleeping Computer, about Larry Abrams, all the good work he's done over the years. And so point is, between those 3 sites, you can get a pretty good handle on what your options are for this particular infection and the possible infection options that are available to you. But just to review those, you may be able to decrypt them for free, may be decryptable if you pay the ransom, or they may not be decryptable. So the point is, if they're not, and if you know that going into it, then you certainly don't want to have the user even consider paying the ransom. That just would be throwing money away. So that's the first category, which brings us to the second category, rogues or PUPs. Now, these were a big problem when I first developed this methodology. They've gotten to be a lot easier these days because, once again, they're obvious. They usually start when Windows starts. They're asking for money. The objective is to trick the user into buying unnecessary software. And the earliest ones were the fake antivirus programs. And since then, they evolved into the phony hardware diagnostics. Your hard drive is failing, but click here, buy our software. We can fix it for you. There are a lot of other variants these days, the system optimizers, internet accelerators, driver updaters, the registry cleaners. All of those are all bogus. There's no value to any of them, but they can be pretty annoying, pretty persistent, and they do, if nothing else, get in the user's way. They pop up, they get in the middle of things, and so just for their nuisance value, sometimes the user will go ahead and say, okay, here's my $30 or $60 or whatever, go away, leave me alone. Well, in most cases these days, they are actually pretty easy to get rid of. But worst case scenario, they will frequently block your normal removal methods like Task Manager and Regedit. With a lot of these, you won't even be able to get to those anymore. But when I talk about the good news, first of all, here's an example. This is an old one, Smart Fortress 2012. And once again, this was sold as an exploit kit. I've actually seen about 30 different variations of this same software with different names, different colors, different icons. But at a glance, especially to the average user, that looks pretty much like a normal antivirus type program. It's all bogus. It's a flash movie that plays the bar down here working its way across and changing the name of the scan, the file it's scanning. It's all bogus. But the point is, with programs like that these days, there are a couple of ways you can probably get rid of them. Good old add remove programs. We'll frequently get rid of them these days. They didn't up until a few years ago, but in the last 2 or 3 years, the great majority of PUPs and rogues I've seen like this, if you just go into add remove programs or even the Windows 10 uninstall, you can uninstall them, they'll go away and not come back. So they have at least gotten much better behaved in that sense. Part of that is them trying to look more respectable. And so normally, if you're going to do that, what I recommend you do is go into the old-fashioned add remove programs and sort by installation date. And you're likely to see anywhere from 2 or 3 to 6 or 8 or 10 of them all installed on the same date, which pretty well tells you they all were the result of a particular download or user clicking on something or whatever. And just one at a time, uninstall all of them, and you'll probably solve the problem right there. If not, most of the anti-malware programs these days do a real good job of finding and getting rid of them, especially Malwarebytes. I've been a fan of Malwarebytes for quite a few years, and they've gotten better and better. And so any of them that you can't get rid of through add remove programs, probably Malwarebytes will do it for you. Another possibility is System Restore. System Restore will at least take you back to a time before that PUP or rogue was active. It won't normally uninstall it, but if it takes you back to the time before the payload was activated, then that could remove some of the roadblocks and the things that might keep you from getting rid of it the old-fashioned way. But that should be all you need to know about taking care of those Category 2 rogues and PUPs. So that brings us to Category 3, the traditional malware. And on the flow chart, I mentioned this is where you're going to spend the biggest part of your time. So unlike the first 2 categories, in most cases, there's no obvious symptoms of infection. The user or the client is unlikely to know that they have any traditional malware on the system. And even a fairly experienced tech may not know it unless you know exactly what to look for and how to deal with it. Once again, they've gotten much more sophisticated over the last few years, to the point that a lot of them now use what's known as a buddy system. What that means is, in addition to the malware itself, there's another process running whose sole purpose is to see if the main malware process has been terminated, and if it has, to reactivate it. It may just be as simple as restarting it. They may have to reinstall it or even re-download it, but that's how powerful some of these buddy systems can be. So when I talked about the malware you get rid of, but it comes back, that would be a pretty good example of a buddy system at work. Point is, malware has been around for over 25 years now. Some of it's still pretty simplistic, but most of it these days is very complex, has a lot of tentacles in a lot of places. I mentioned payloads and the difference between the category of malware and the payload. The payload is what it's actually there to do, whether it's stealing data, setting a backdoor, a keylogger, turning that computer into a member of a botnet. Popular payload these days, as I mentioned, is cryptocurrency mining, and of course replication, spreading to other computers, is another possible payload, but that's not nearly as common these days as it was in the past, but still something you need to be aware of and look out for. So what you're going to want to do is go through a process at a time and identify any of these malicious processes. And what I'm going to demonstrate to you now is using Task Manager to do that. A lot of you are probably familiar with Process Explorer, which is like Task Manager on steroids. So that gives you some additional functionality, but knowing that all of you are not familiar with Process Explorer, I'm just going to use Task Manager for this example. And Process Explorer is another whole subject. But when you go into Task Manager, and this is just kind of the 50,000-foot overview of what you want to do. In Windows 8 or later, Windows 10, here you go to the Details tab and initially sort by name. And just look for anything that doesn't look right at a glance. Now, this is going to fall into several steps. First step that I do is go through those actual names, looking for something that I can identify right off as being malicious. There aren't going to be many of those, But back over the years, there have been several pieces of malware that their executable name has been very well known, like msblast.exe was the blaster virus. Load.exe was Surcam. And so there's some like that you'll recognize, but there are not very many these days. What you're more likely to see is a pattern, not necessarily a name, but what the name looks like. If you see something that is an all-numeric name, 1111111.exe, then in my experience, those are usually going to be malware, or 123456 or whatever. If you see something that starts with an underscore, doesn't have to be, but all of those I have personally seen have been malware. If it's 31 characters long and that name is made up of capital and lowercase letters that don't appear to stand for or spell anything, that would commonly be an example of malware. So those are some of the things that you're looking for in the name category. Once you've been through that, I'm not going to go through this whole list. Obviously, I've got a lot of Chrome tabs open, and so there's no point in looking at all of my stuff. But that's the general approach. But next, I would sort on description. Now, the first thing you're looking for is anything with a blank description. Most malware won't bother to take the time to put anything in the description. So anything that's blank in there, you want to definitely check it out and make sure that it is something legitimate and there's a good reason for it to be there. But again, that's not 100%, but it's an indicator. Once you've been through all of those, then it's time to go back and sort alphabetically by name. And here's where you're going to spend the most detailed time. That's what I call the consistency check. What you want to do, and I didn't point it out initially, but my task manager doesn't look like yours does by default. I've added a couple of columns here, and I recommend you do the same thing. I've added, well, the description should be there by default. Command line probably isn't. And there's some others that you may want to consider, but these are the main ones. You want to be sure the process ID is there. It may or may not be there by default, but you're definitely going to need to have it for more extensive troubleshooting. But with these in place, you want to look at the name here, application frame host.exe, and check that and make sure it corresponds to the description. And then check the command line. Most of the Windows components, most of the parts of Windows that are from Microsoft and the standard part of Windows will probably be in Windows System 32. In this case, that's where it is, and executable matches what you see in the name. So that I'm going to assume is legitimate.
Ken?
Next is, yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So what you're doing here, and just to give context, a lot of this goes back to, and you certainly would have been there, Ken, but do you remember the books by Brian Livingston, Windows Secrets? And we would get down into these files, and it wasn't so much malware, but it was more how to optimize early editions of Windows in the 1990s and that kind of thing. But this brings back a lot of memories. Now for the question, can you right click on, say, that first one you're highlighting, row 2, the .exe? Is there a chance to right click and go to properties from this screen? I don't know. I'm just curious if I can get properties.
Yeah, you can go to properties. That will give you some additional information, but frankly, I think it would be more clutter at this point. Most of what you need to know for now is going to be right there in Task Manager, and even more so in Process Explorer. But even in Task Manager, you've got enough to make the basic determination as to whether this is a suspicious process or not.
Yeah. Okay. Please continue. Thank you.
Okay. Good question. Thanks, Harry. So. ARM-SVC, most of us recognize that executable name as being the Adobe Acrobat Update Service, which sure enough, the description says the same thing. And it's in program files, x86, common files, Adobe ARM. So yes, it's exactly where it should be with the right executable. So that passes muster. So that's the general procedure we're going through here. Now you come down to chrome.exe and your first inclination is, oh, I know what Chrome is. I don't even need to check that. Careful, that's how the bad guys slip past you. So I'm going to go ahead and look at Chrome. Chrome.exe, and it says Google Chrome, and it's in program files x86, Google Chrome application, Chrome.exe. So yes, that is exactly what it should be. But trust me, every now and then you're going to see one that says C:\Windows\temp/ whatever. That would be an example of the bad guys using the executable name Chrome.exe to try to fake you out. But in fact, if it's not in the right place, then that's your indicator. So that's what I'm talking about by the consistency check here. So if you've been doing this a long time and you recognize most of the executables, then it's going to be not a terribly time-consuming process, but you may end up with 6 or 8 or 10 processes that are at least suspicious to you, that you need to dig deeper into and make more of a determination. And when you get to that point, I'm going to come back to my PowerPoint and back to the flow chart. So what you're going to do is when you see a process you're suspicious of, kill it and see what happens. At that point, one of two things is going to happen. Either Windows is going to keep running just fine or it's not. And if it doesn't, if killing that process kills Windows, then you know that at least that is a required process. Not the same as saying that it's not malicious, but at least it's required. If, for instance, it's an infected version of Explorer.exe, well, you're going to have it, but it is infected. So you have to come back and do more with that. But again, we're going after the initial determination here. In most cases, killing that process is not going to kill Windows. So the next thing you want to look for, does it come back on its own? If it does, that could be an indication that there's a buddy process at work, seeing that you killed it and reactivating it. So at that point, make a note that's a confirmed suspicious process you're going to need to do some more digging into. On the other hand, if it didn't come back and it didn't kill Windows, then you theoretically could remove it from the registry and keep it from coming back permanently. I'd recommend you do more investigation before you do that, because it could be something that's perfectly legitimate, but you just don't happen to need right now, like a fingerprint reader or a DVD burner or camera or something like that. So do some more investigation, but if you do figure out from that point that it is malicious, go ahead and remove it from the registry to keep it from coming back. With all of these, you end up back at the number 1, which says go back and look for the next one. And so again, it's an iterative process. You'll take a process at a time and go through that until you have eliminated or at least identified any potentially suspicious processes that are running and dealt with them. But eventually you get all those taken care of. You come down here to the number 2, which is to look for a rootkit and deal with it. So with that, we'll go back to where I think we were. Yeah. Okay. So there it is verbally. Kill it, determine the activation method, remove it, and then delete or clean infected programs and block the ability to reinstall. That would be getting rid of the buddy process, and then lather, rinse, repeat. So that brings us to category 4, which is rootkits. Of course, rootkits are the most deeply buried form of malware that are out there. They're within the operating system itself. And even a pretty experienced tech is likely to not be able to detect a rootkit, much less get rid of it, because there are usually no symptoms that are obvious to the user or even to the tech unless you know exactly what to look for. So here are some of the common symptoms that I've found of rootkits. In some cases, they'll cause Google redirects. Now, I say Google, it could be whatever, whether it's Bing or Yahoo, God forbid, or whatever search engine the user is using. But the point is, if they fairly frequently click on one of those links that the search results led them to and it goes somewhere completely unrelated, that could be a pretty good indication there's a rootkit present. It won't be every time. It may be every 10th time, or the third one after every 5th search, or whatever, something apparently random, but if it happens on a fairly regular basis, that's a pretty good indication there's a rootkit present. Another indication, if you can't manually do Windows updates, I haven't seen as much of that in Windows 10. In fact, I don't know that I've seen any of it, but especially on the older operating system, that was pretty common. Even the automatic updates might work normally, but if you go to manually install Windows updates, it might fail predictably in a given way, and that was a pretty strong indicator of a rootkit infection. Another indicator that wasn't as common, but I saw it a good bit over the years, is you download a file, it downloads normally, but after it's finished downloading, you get a message that pops up from the system tray saying, the file you just downloaded, mbamsetup.exe or whatever, was infected, so it's been deleted. If you see that, it's always a rootkit. So those are some of the common symptoms that would indicate there is a rootkit present. And so the other problem is that even most anti-malware programs don't have much, if any, rootkit detection. Some do, some better than others. And I'll get back to Malwarebytes. They have greatly improved their rootkit detection in the latest versions. And in fact, if you look at Malwarebytes, and this is not an ad for Malwarebytes, it's just one I assume most of you are using, you all know about, and so I'll just tell you that there is now an option in Malwarebytes that says scan for rootkits. By default, that option is not selected. Even without that option selected, it will find and remove most rootkits. So I'd say if you're looking for rootkits, use Malwarebytes initially without that option checked. And if it doesn't find anything, check the option. It'll take longer, but if there's a rootkit out there, that'll probably detect and get rid of it. So those are the 4 categories. Now, the rootkits themselves come in different flavors. The early rootkits actually infected the boot sector of the floppy disk. That's how old rootkits are. They go back to the floppy disk days. Obviously, these days, they're infecting the boot sector of the hard drive, network drive, or whatever, thumb drive, external hard drive. Any of those boot sectors or master boot records could be infected. They'll also commonly infect legitimate Windows processes. So the problem is if you're going through Task Manager or even Process Explorer, you're not going to see anything that looks out of the ordinary. You'll see normal Explorer.exe, LSASS.exe, all of the things you expect to see, with no easy way to tell that those have actually been infected or malicious code has been injected into legitimate Windows processes. A newer type of rootkit is what's known as a TDL3, and now it's evolved into TDL4 rootkits. They infect the .sys files. The sys files are the device drivers. Now, there are 2 types of sys files. The original type of sys files that a lot of us dealt with were the ones that were in your auto-exec and config as part of the startup. But those are just what we called 80-column card images. The sys files we're talking about here are actually executable code that serve as the interface between the device itself and Windows. They're what make a device work. And so there are hundreds of generic sys files that come with Windows. And depending on the devices you buy, whether it's a camera, an external hard drive, or whatever, it may come with its own sys files that give you the optimum usage of that device. But point is, those files get infected. They don't even show up in Task Manager, so there's no easy way for you and me to see sys files, which ones are running, much less whether they're infected or not. So that was a pretty good way of hiding, pretty effective way of hiding with the TDL3 and now TDL4 rootkits. The latest twist that became popular a couple of years ago was the fileless malware. That's a little bit misleading because obviously when malware first comes onto the system, there is a file involved. But what it does is inject some malicious code normally into the registry itself, and then the file gets deleted. So there's no infected file left behind on the hard drive for an anti-malware program to scan and get rid of. So that's why it's referred to as fileless malware. And one came out a couple of years ago that was very widespread, and it was pretty tough to deal with initially until, once again, we figured it out and came up with a procedure for dealing with it. It was called Poweliks, P-O-W-E-L-I-K-S. And I haven't seen that one around for a couple of years now, but I keep hearing rumors. And in fact, there was an article, a blog post from Microsoft recently talking about how many more fileless malware infections they're seeing recently. I haven't personally seen them or even had any of them referred to me, but I'm sure they're coming back. But one more thing the more sophisticated rootkits will do is actually block execution of anti-rootkit programs. There are specific anti-rootkit programs out there beyond just your generic anti-malware programs. And I've mentioned Malwarebytes and its anti-rootkit capability. The other one I commonly use and recommend is from Kaspersky, TDSS Killer. That is a specific anti-rootkit program. There are others out there, but what I'm saying is, in some cases, you can't run TDSS Killer or Malwarebytes because the rootkit itself is recognizing you're trying to run that and it's blocking execution of it. So those are some of the challenges and characteristics of rootkits overall. So that's the whole methodology. And just a quick review: step 1, any encrypting ransomware, deal with it. Figure out what, if anything, you can do about getting the data files back. Hopefully you've got unencrypted backups you can restore and it becomes a non-issue. Getting rid of the ransomware infection itself is easy. Again, as was mentioned in the question, there may be a question of identifying patient 0 and seeing what workstation was actually infected and the source of the infection, cleaning it up. But it's rare for a server to actually be infected, but common for a server to be the host of the encrypted data files. Second, any rogue software or PUPs, and again, those are pretty easy to get rid of these days, either through Windows 10 uninstall or the traditional add remove programs, or worst case with something like Malwarebytes. Then your traditional malware, the viruses, worms, Trojans, and with their associated keyloggers, backdoors, and whatever. And finally, with the rootkits. So that's the overall overview of the methodology. Again, I've done these presentations enough to know some common questions that come up, so I'll go ahead and address some of those. What about safe mode? Some vendors and some people that claim to be experts in malware removal say, start off by going into safe mode. That's not my normal approach. In my opinion, there are a couple of problems with safe mode. For one, if you're booted into safe mode, you're not seeing what the user's seeing. And so if you're not seeing it, you can't be sure you've gotten all of it and gotten rid of it. So you may miss some of the malware if you're doing a cleanup in safe mode. Some required functions may not be available to you in safe mode. So that can be a limitation, kind of having your hands tied to not be able to do everything you'd want to. So again, there may be times you need to use safe mode, but when I do it for a shorter period as possible, and usually with networking, because the reality is to get rid of malware, you're probably going to need access to the network, either to access the internet or maybe to access a shared folder, a file, a printer, or whatever. So the potential downside of that, of course, is if there is replication involved, then connecting to the network could potentially spread it, but that's a small percentage of the malware that I've seen over the last couple of years. Another common question, I've actually touched on this earlier, system restore. Unfortunately, that's one of the first things that a lot of malware will do is disable the system restore functionality, either the ability to run the program itself or to actually delete the system restore data file. So there's nothing there for it to restore to. Now, one thing I'll just mention here, if you haven't run into it, I found a lot of Windows 10 systems that have had system restore turned off, sometimes right out of the box. So one thing I normally do now as a part of setup of a new system is to be sure that A, system restore is enabled, and B, there's enough space to make a reasonable number of restore points. Because I have also seen some systems where system restore was turned on, but the maximum amount of space was set to 0. So obviously that's the same as having system restore turned off. As far as a reasonable amount of space, obviously hard drives have gotten a lot bigger these days than when system restore was new. So if you're talking about a terabyte hard drive or a half terabyte SSD, I'd say 30, 40, 50 gigabytes would give you plenty of system restore space. On the other hand, I dealt with a system just the other day that only had 128 gig SSD in it. And so space was at more of a premium. I set that to a maximum of 10 gigabytes. But point is, in a few gigabytes, you can have a few restore points. And if you've got at least one, that's better than nothing. But another thing just to be aware of is that there are some techniques that malware can use to survive safe mode. So even in safe mode, you still may not be able to run system restore, but there's an alternative to that, which is boot to a command prompt and run system restore from there. That will, in my experience, always work. If the data files haven't been deleted, or if the system restore program itself, rstrui.exe is the program name. If that's still there, and if the restore files are still present, then you should always be able to do a system restore one way or another. But even a successful system restore generally doesn't remove any malware. The exception to that is if the malware is still in the temp folder or temporary internet files or some temporary area, system restore will get rid of those. But if the malware has actually been installed in a permanent location, like program files, x86, whatever, then system restore won't get rid of it. But once again, it will take you back to a time before that malware was activated, before the obstacles were set to keep you from being able to run Task Manager or Regedit or whatever. So system restore can serve a useful purpose, but again, first step is to be sure that it is actually enabled, running, and generating restore points on a periodic basis. So that's the overview. All of this is part of a much more involved workshop I call virus remediation training. So if this whets your appetite, and if you want to dive deeper and be able to do all this in the most efficient way possible, and are really committed to getting appropriate training and spending a few dollars, it is available to you. Not going to do a big sales pitch for you here, but I will at least tell you the basics of what's involved. It's a 2-day workshop. Now, I say 2 days, it's actually 2 half days, because it's really intense, concentrated, brain-burning type training. So I spread it out over 2 4-hour sessions on 2 consecutive days normally. And that consists of 3 pieces: education, tools, and the methodology. You've seen the methodology. Some of the tools are already available to you. Some are proprietary that only come with the full workshop. And of course, the education is part of it as well. But in addition to that, 2 days of interactive training, there's a good bit of pre-recorded content. At the moment, at least 4 or 5 hours, I'll be referring you to directly as soon as the workshop is over. And there are over 50 hours worth of other content that I personally created, depending on, again, where you want to go from there. I do these sometimes in person in my office or on site. If you're an MSP and have at least 5 techs typically that need the training, it could be cost effective to do it at your location. And I do a lot of them online. And so those are the options. Again, I normally schedule one workshop, a public workshop every month here in my office, or it could be at your location on your schedule. And I normally schedule 2 dates remotely. And those are done at different times of day to accommodate different time zones. And so if you want more details on that schedule and pricing for on-site training, there's my email address. And yes, there is a cost involved, but it's very nominal. $4.95 for attendee in US dollars. And as an attendee of this webinar and an SMB Nation participant, I'm going to give you a 15% discount on that tuition. If you have 3 or more techs, then talk to me about volume pricing. But for 5 or more, again, it could be most cost effective for you to arrange a private workshop, either online for just your people or for me to physically come to you. Now, as the commercials would say, but wait, there's more. There's a lot more I'm not going to go into. The point is, if this looks attractive to you, there's a lot more than just the workshop for that, including mostly 12 months of updates. I do a monthly webinar I call my Continuing Malware Education Program, and those are the community meetings that happen every month. I've been doing those for almost 3 years now, and so there's 35 actually recorded sessions available to any of the participants in that. There's also additional software and a lot of other stuff that, again, I'm not going to bore you with all the other stuff, but the point is the people that have taken this full workshop report that their return on that investment is typically measured in weeks or sometimes days. So the dollars become pretty much a no-brainer. So again, that's the end of the commercial for it. If you want more details, my website, thevirusdoc.com. And if you do decide to attend one, here's the coupon code for SMB Nation, SMBNAT15, that will give you the 50% discount promised if you register online for a workshop. If you want to call me and talk about it before you register, that's fine. I'm happy to talk to anybody that's in the business and wants to learn more, and just pick my brain. So there's my email address, my phone number, and
okay,
that will go to my voicemail, but I get those messages pretty regularly.
Ken, you up for some questions?
You bet.
All righty. Let me back up. Some you may have covered off on. We had Jason Hopwood saying, isn't that assuming this is a window dangerous window file? That's from some time ago, so I'm gonna that's a share. Jason had a comment about dangerous Windows files earlier in your presentation. Let's move on. Ron Hardy out of Gig Harbor, Washington says, the malware knows that system programs are in System 32, etc. They can masquerade by placing their files in there. Again, more of a comment from Ron Hardy. Maybe if you want to reaffirm that.
Yeah, that is accurate.
Okay. All right. We have Howard Bloom saying he likes Macintosh. That's fine. We see it all, Ken, on the comment screen.
I'm sure.
Here's a good one from Bill Perry.
Stress that, Harry, because as everybody knows, Macs are not immune to malware.
Yeah.
But full disclosure, this workshop is just about the Windows environment. I don't talk about Macs. I don't talk about Androids or iPads. It's strictly Windows environment.
That's actually
said that it's Windows all the way back to Windows 2000 through Windows 10, Server 2018, all the way back to Server 2003, Windows NT4, all of them.
It's a fair point. Then we have Bill Perry saying, do you recommend having Malwarebytes running in parallel with the AV antivirus?
The reason I hesitate is because Malwarebytes themselves have changed their answer to that question in the last year or so. They always position the product as one to run alongside other anti-malware products. In the last year and a few months, they made the decision to position themselves now as the only anti-malware product that you need. In doing that, what I've seen is some performance issues, some conflicts with some other resident active protection programs. So I love Malwarebytes. I work with them on a regular basis. They're great people, great integrity. I have nothing but good things to say about the company and their products. And I will tell you that I normally don't run active protection for Malwarebytes alongside any other anti-malware product. And once again, full disclosure, I do not run it as an only anti-malware product on any of my systems or my clients.
Okay.
Now, one more piece of that, because everybody knows about Malwarebytes and their scanner, and unfortunately, a lot of attacks are still using the free version, which they can't legally do, but that doesn't bother some people. But if you're not familiar with the Malwarebytes Tech Bench program, you need to be. That's something that, again, they introduced about a year ago for techs, and to make it not only more affordable to use the product legally, but they also include a program called the Malwarebytes Toolset, MBTS, which is great. It's a portable version of the scanner, which runs much faster, doesn't require installation, got a lot of other stuff on it too. And again, not a big sales pitch for Malwarebytes, but if you don't know about the Malwarebytes Tech Bench program and Malwarebytes Toolset, you need to be. Highly, highly recommended, and that's what I do all of my scans with when I get to the point of scanning at that last block on the flow chart.
Okay, let me line up the next question. Mark Dahlquist asks, have you seen any ransomware payload not propagated as an attachment to email like the DHL shipment notifications?
Oh, sure.
So you have.
Yeah, that's a pretty low-tech way of doing it these days. It's still a common way, but one of the biggest changes in the last couple of years has been the increase in malvertising. What they'll do is go to a perfectly legitimate website and take yahoo.com or AOL.com or New York Times, or any of the top 25 or top 100 websites for that matter. Most of them have advertisements on them. And as geeks, most of us know those advertisements are not hard-coded in the web page. The web page has a box that says insert ad here. And then they use an ad server to plug in an appropriate ad for that user based on their cookies, their search history, or whatever. And so the point is, the bad guys have pushed out malicious infected ads and put them on the ad servers, and they're really good at SEO. And so that ad comes up, and as soon as it renders, bing, that computer is infected without the user doing anything stupid, anything different from what they've done every day for the last 2 or 3 years. So yes, there are a lot of other infection vectors out there. It's way beyond just the infected attachments.
Okay. We have Jason Omans coming to us from Bainbridge Island, Washington, near and dear to my heart. And Jason says, when I find processes in Task Manager I'm not familiar with, what resources do you recommend I use to research them aside from a general internet search?
You know, there are several sites over the years that have been real useful, and frankly, Microsoft has done a lot to reduce our need to do nearly as much manual research as we used to. In Task Manager, ever since Vista, you've got the ability to see the vendor and the description, which you used to have to dig out and search on and everything else. And so just Task Manager with those additional columns added can make a big difference. And a big step beyond that, of course, is Process Explorer, which gives you a whole world of additional information. Beyond that, there have been a few sites that I've used in the past I frankly haven't needed in the last few years. So I don't know if they're even still out there anymore.
Yep. Well, you know, the thing about Task Manager, I have a question from Bill Perry who's saying, I'll read the question, maybe I'll just read it. It says, I don't see in Task Manager where to add the command line in the details page.
That's a good question. I apologize. I kind of glossed over it in the interest of time, but it's something that a lot of people have not had occasion to know about. Now, depending on what version of Windows you're looking at, of course, most of us and most of our clients now are on Windows 8 or later, but there's still a lot of Windows 7 out there and even some XP. But starting in Windows 8, the way that you add those columns or change the columns is to right-click in this title bar. So if you right-click out here, you've got Hide Column and Select Columns. So go to Select Columns, and you'll see there are a whole lot of columns available that I have not selected. So that just gives you some idea how much you can put out there. But again, what you see on my task manager is what I find useful. We didn't talk about process ID, but again, that when you dig deeper, that's one of the things that becomes a really important piece of the puzzle as well. So there's command line and description. You want to be sure that those are there. And I do want to just address the older operating systems, because even back in Windows 7, the way you add columns or change columns is completely different. It's under View, and there's Select Columns under there, which doesn't show up here on the newer operating systems. But the point is that capability has been around for a long time. But again, it's one of those things that people didn't know about. So I appreciate the question being asked, and hope that's some additional useful information for you.
Okay, then we have Roger Lang asking or saying, good to be with you, Ken and Harry, great info. But I was wondering if you would share what remote access platform you're using. Roger, I don't know if you mean for today's webinar, which is GoToWebinar, or Ken, maybe Roger is asking what kind of remote management, what kind of remote access tool do you use?
That's a good question. I believe Roger's actually a graduate of my workshop. I know several of my graduates had indicated they were going to be on here. But the short answer is I use a program called Instant House Call. I really like Instant House Call as a program. It's from a company in Canada. Corey Fruitman is the founder, CEO, and then the person behind Instant House Call, who is just a prince of a guy. Great support, great product. I can't say enough good things about Corey. So it's what I've been using for the last 3, 4, 5 years, and I've looked at a lot of the others. I'll mention 2 others by name because they're frequently used by the tech support scammers, and so anytime I see them, I automatically get rid of them. One that's not as common anymore, but it was for quite a while, is AMMY, AMMYY. That's a free one that a lot of the tech support scammers used. The other one that's a perfectly legitimate program, and AMMY is too. I've used it myself in the past, but TeamViewer is the one that I most frequently now see used by the scammers. So anybody that's using TeamViewer, just kind of guilt by association, I think it might be time to consider, especially if renewal is coming up. I understand it's a good bit more expensive these days than Instant House Call. So unpaid pitch for Corey Fruitman, Instant House Call. Great product. Good question.
Okay, great. And then Jason Hopwood, I'll answer this question. Jason was asking about System 32, very close to what Roger our friend in Gig Harbor was asking. So Jason, you're asking if a virus places a file in System 32 directory that it would be infected. I think we covered off on that earlier that yes, that would be the case.
That's one more thing they will do to try to make it look legitimate.
Okay, Ken Burgess is asking, he says, Ken, how do you detect and remediate either a boot sector malware or fileless malware? How do you detect and remediate?
Well, unfortunately, in most cases, because of the way that rootkits in general work, they're at a level that we can't easily look into and identify. And so that's when you deal with a rootkit, you're mostly kind of at the mercy of anti-rootkit programs. There's one in particular that will give you more insight and let you see what's running. It's called Gmer, Gmer, that will show you those sys files that are currently loaded and some more things like that. And it has remove kit detection and removal capability in it as well. And other than that, the main thing that you can do is recognize the symptoms that I talked about earlier to let you know that in fact there is a rootkit, and you need to run one or more anti-rootkit programs to confirm that and get rid of it. So.
Okay, and then Ken, we have Jerry Wyzerka and David Ham and a couple of others asking if you could go back to the slide deck and go to your contact information slide so people could write down how to reach you.
Be happy to do that. And,
we have Howard Bloom asking, ask him why the rootkit detection is turned off by default. Rootkit detection is turned off by default.
That is strictly a decision that, hang on, let me, there, okay, that Malwarebytes made based on the fact that having that option selected greatly increases the scan time. The scan time on a given machine may be, say, 10 minutes. with that option unchecked. With it checked, it may be 30 minutes. So, and again, even with it unchecked, my experience has been that it still catches about 90% of the rootkits. So that's why I would say initially, when you're scanning with Malwarebytes, leave it unchecked. Now, if you're talking about an SSD and a fast machine, then sure, go ahead and check it. But it will significantly impact the overall scan time.
Okay, and a couple people are asking, yes, this presentation has been recorded and is available for replay. Ken, I believe we've cleared the deck on questions. So congratulations, my friend. Big audience, attentive audience, engaged audience, and I'm sure you're used to that. You're speaking on a timely topic and you stay current. So I appreciate that.
And it keeps changing.
And so, folks, I'm coming to you live from the Spice World 2018 conference in Austin, Texas, hosted by Spiceworks. Again, put it on your calendar for next October. It's a geekathon. It's a little bit of Comic-Con. It's Ken. I saw you up here last year. It's a fun show and a lot of content. So, folks, hope to see you there next week. I'm in Montreal next week with SureWeb Accelerate. Week off after that, then the following week in the month with Ingram One in Washington, D.C. So I'm out of words. Ken, thank you so much again, Jenny, in the radio control room as usual. Folks, have a great day, and we'll get you some resources and links in the thank you note that goes out tomorrow. Bye-bye.
And Harry and Jenny, thank you, and thanks to all the participants for taking your time, and I trust you found some value in it. So let me know if I can help you.
All right. Well, thank you. And again, hey, one more shout out to SolarWinds MSP Anywhere. We're going to get you some links for that as well. Have a great day, everybody.